This is also a time of change for my family.
King Charles had braced himself for hard conversations, family quarrels, even open challenges to his authority. But nothing had readied him for the document laid on his desk that morning. Meghan had not merely asked to step back into royal life. She had formally demanded stewardship of a protected patronage that belonged solely to Catherine, a role sealed by the late Queen herself, shielded by centuries of palace custom, and forbidden by tradition from ever passing to anyone outside the working royal circle. Before we go any further into what this truly means for the royal family, tap that subscribe button so you never miss an update. Charles was seated with his private secretaries when the sealed envelope was brought in. He had expected perhaps a proposal for joint charity work, some quiet gesture aimed at easing old wounds. Instead, the very first page shifted the entire mood of the room. The Queen's Covenant for Children and Families, a protected royal patronage, meaning a charitable duty personally assigned by the monarch, sat at the heart of Meghan's demand. She was requesting temporary control of it, even though the role belonged to Catherine and could not be reassigned without the king's direct approval. The monarch read the pages once. Then he read them a second time. Meghan's words did not sound like an offer of assistance. The covenant, she argued, required a globally recognized woman capable of stretching its influence far beyond British borders, language that quietly suggested Catherine no longer had the capacity to carry it forward. Charles grasped exactly why that framing struck so hard. The late Queen had placed that patronage in the princess's hands as a symbol of trust, of continuity, of enduring duty. William broke the news to Catherine in private. She listened without cutting in, but the calm on her face shifted the moment he confessed that Meghan's submission had described the patronage as vacant. Catherine echoed the word once. Vacant. The prince watched the pain settle beneath her composure. Meghan had taken her reduced public schedule and reframed it as proof that she could be swapped out. Charles felt a second jolt as he examined the wording more closely. Several phrases mirrored a restricted palace memorandum, including a dormant transfer clause, a seldom-used provision that outlined temporary stewardship during a royal absence. That material had never been meant for outside eyes. Someone familiar with palace archives had helped Meghan shape her case. This was no longer a bold family request. It was a coordinated move. When the secretaries filed out, Charles took off his glasses and pressed his fingers into his forehead. "She has crossed the boundary," he murmured, "the one she was warned never to touch." Before he could respond, William asked to see him at once. The future king walked in tense, empty-handed, but certain about who had fed Meghan the forbidden language. What had started as a daring request was hardening into something far more perilous, a battle over Catherine's dignity, Meghan's unfinished royal ambitions, and Charles's ability to shield his own family from within. Behind the ceremonial title of that patronage stood three people carrying three very different injuries. Catherine viewed it as a sacred vow made during the final chapter of Queen Elizabeth's life. Meghan saw it as evidence that the palace had denied her the platform she believed was hers. Charles saw both women planted on opposite banks of a family fracture he had never managed to mend. Now, a single protected role threatened to drag every buried resentment back to the surface. Catherine had earned the Queen's Covenant through years of quiet, focused work, centered on children, stable homes, and early development. The patronage was a royal charitable duty carried in the monarch's name, but the late Queen had never treated it as a decorative gift. In a private written instruction, she had described it as a lifelong obligation and placed its future squarely in the princess's hands. Meghan carried a very different memory of that era. She had once expected to spearhead a major Commonwealth initiative, meaning a charitable program tied to the network of nations historically bound to the crown. After stepping away from royal duties, she became increasingly convinced that opportunities meant for her had been quietly steered toward Catherine instead. During a strained conversation with Harry, she insisted her new request was not a strike against anyone. It was, she said, an attempt to reclaim work she had always been qualified to lead. Catherine felt the timing of it far more sharply than the demand itself. She had been carefully rebuilding her strength, easing back into public life, protecting her family while the entire country watched every step she took. Meghan had chosen that fragile moment to describe the role as needing stronger leadership. To the princess, that was more than ambition. It was an attempt to convert her suffering into evidence of weakness. William carried the buried answer straight to his father. The Queen's personal covenant did allow another working royal to offer temporary support, but neither the patronage's title nor its authority could be transferred while Catherine remained in active service. The prince told the king this was not a flexible tradition to be interpreted case by case. It was a direct instruction written precisely to prevent this kind of maneuver. Camilla spotted another danger entirely. She warned Charles that a blunt refusal could easily be spun into a public narrative about Meghan being blocked from helping vulnerable children. The Queen consort saw the trap for exactly what it was: approve the request and betray Catherine, or reject it and appear heartless. The king finally understood how carefully the claim had been constructed. Catherine stood beside the cabinet holding the covenant's original silver emblem. She did not reach for it. She simply told William she would not fight Meghan in public over something the Queen had already entrusted to her care. The prince answered quietly. Catherine might not want a war, but someone inside the older palace structure had already picked one on her behalf. To understand how Meghan had gained both the confidence and the confidential knowledge to make such a demand, Charles would have to look back at one royal ceremony everyone had tried to forget. The move to seize Catherine's patronage did not begin with the letter Charles received. It began months earlier, inside a crowded hall at St. James's Palace, when a single empty chair became more powerful than any speech given that night. Catherine was absent. Meghan was watching from across the ocean, and an aging royal advisor made one careless remark about temporary succession. That single sentence crossed continents, slipped into the wrong conversation, and eventually returned to the king as an outright challenge. Princess Anne stepped up that evening because Catherine could not attend. She read brief remarks on the princess's behalf, but she never claimed the role for herself. The annual covenant ceremony was the moment when the patronage's formal plans were presented to supporters. Catherine's empty chair remained untouched, a quiet declaration that the position was still hers even in her absence. Sir Malcolm Avery noticed that chair too. The former palace advisor had helped draft the covenant's early administrative rules, meaning the private instructions that governed how the patronage could be supported or protected. After the ceremony ended, he spoke freely with several guests about what might unfold if Catherine could not maintain a full public schedule. That conversation should have died in that room. It did not. Avery mentioned to an American charity executive that a dormant continuity clause allowed the monarch to appoint a temporary steward. The clause was a rarely invoked rule designed to keep the work moving during a royal absence. Days later, that same executive repeated the detail during a private call with Meghan. Where others had heard procedure, she heard opportunity. Meghan fixed her attention on the empty chair. She argued that the palace was preserving appearances, while the patronage was quietly starving for active leadership. To her, Catherine's absence proved the covenant needed someone ready to carry it beyond Britain. Catherine later discovered that photographs of that very chair had been passed around among Meghan's advisors. What she felt was colder than anger. Her most difficult absence had been studied like a business opening. William uncovered the deeper strategy. One of Meghan's legal consultants had contacted Avery 3 separate times after the ceremony, pressing for details about the covenant's status, its finances, and its royal insignia. The prince also identified what the submission had deliberately hidden. Any temporary steward was required to be a senior working royal acting under Catherine's own authority. Meghan's team had simply stripped that restriction out of their argument. Charles summoned Avery for a private accounting. The advisor entered leaning on a walking stick and admitted that his careless words had opened the door. When he left, he forgot the stick beside his chair. The king stared at it in silence, realizing that one man's loose talk had been sharpened into another woman's weapon. Charles ordered the request kept quiet until he could speak with Meghan directly. But by then, she was already in London, expecting a negotiation. Secretaries and legal language would no longer be enough. The confrontation had already begun. There were no cameras inside the room, no press statements, no smiling relatives arranged carefully between them. Only Charles, Meghan, and the protected name of the woman who was not yet present. The king walked in, intending to hear an explanation. Meghan arrived ready to argue a case. Within minutes, though, the conversation stopped resembling a discussion about charity. It became a reckoning over rejection, entitlement, loyalty, and the royal future both of them believed they were defending. Charles refused Meghan's request to bring her advisors into the room. Clarence House was the king's London residence, and he wanted this handled as a family matter before it calcified into an official royal crisis. Meghan accepted the condition, but she did not soften her position. She said the covenant had been held back by caution, that she could bring international donors, global partnerships, and a level of attention the palace had never managed to attract. Meghan spoke with tight, measured confidence. She insisted the work mattered more than tradition, and that children should not be paying the price for a royal family afraid of change. Charles heard her out until he asked the one question she had avoided from the very beginning. Why had Catherine not been consulted before the application was submitted? Meghan replied without pause. Permission, she said, was not required from the person whose inactivity had created the need for intervention. Charles pushed his chair back. The restraint drained from his voice. "You are asking for what was never yours," he told her, "and using Catherine's pain to justify taking it." The king reminded her that stepping back was not surrender. Catherine had reduced her duties to recover, not to abandon a promise placed in her hands. Meghan then let slip the belief driving her claim. During a private recorded conversation with Harry months earlier, she had said Queen Elizabeth once considered giving her a connected Commonwealth role. The Commonwealth was a voluntary association of nations linked by shared history and cooperation. Meghan now framed the covenant request as the correction of an opportunity the institution had quietly denied her. Charles answered with a truth she had never expected to hear. The late Queen had indeed weighed several roles, but she had personally struck Meghan's name from the covenant succession framework, the rules that identified who could temporarily support or inherit authority, after concerns arose about mixing royal power with independent commercial ventures. Meghan's expression shifted. She asked whether Catherine had known. The door opened before Charles could reply. Catherine entered with William and answered that she had learned of it only that morning. The princess did not accuse Meghan of jealousy. She simply asked one direct question. Why had her work been described as abandoned rather than temporarily reduced? Meghan could not answer without exposing the wound sitting beneath the strategy. Charles ended the meeting with a final order. No decision would be issued until the covenant's authority had been reviewed by the two royals empowered to interpret the Queen's private instructions. Meghan had made her demand. Catherine had faced it, and the king now had to decide whether royal power belonged to pressure or to a promise made in silence. The final decision would not be shaped by public popularity, charitable ambition, or even Charles's personal sympathies. Buried beneath the patronage's ceremonial language was a private instruction carrying the moral weight of the late queen herself. It named Catherine, defined the meaning of her stewardship, and warned every future monarch against allowing the role to become a trophy in a family rivalry. When Charles finally heard those words read aloud, Meghan's request stopped sounding ambitious. It began to sound dangerously calculated. Charles met Princess Anne and the keeper of the Privy Seal inside a quiet Windsor library. The keeper was the official charged with safeguarding the monarch's most important formal documents and approvals. Anne had been present when Queen Elizabeth accepted the covenant's final private instructions, and she understood that the document was not symbolic. It was a direct command meant to outlast changing reigns, family pressure, and personal ambition. Anne began to read aloud. The covenant had been designed to operate across decades, not around convenient public schedules. Illness, pregnancy, family duty, or reduced appearances could never be treated as surrender. Catherine's authority remained fully intact because the role had been entrusted to her character, not merely to her availability. Charles listened closely, aware that this single detail collapsed the central argument behind Meghan's claim. Charles admitted what was still troubling him. A harsh rejection could deepen Harry's estrangement and push his younger son even further from the family. Anne did not dismiss the fear. She asked whether protecting one damaged relationship was worth sacrificing Catherine's trust and ignoring their mother's final instructions. The king remembered promising to defend both of his sons' families. Yet neutrality had not delivered peace. It had allowed Catherine's restraint to be read as weakness, and Meghan's pressure to swell into entitlement. Charles now grasped that refusing to choose was itself a choice, and Catherine had been paying the cost. Anne then read the most decisive clause. The patronage could never pass to anyone who had left official royal service, nor to anyone who intended to combine royal authority with independent branding. She also revealed, through a documented palace record, that Meghan's representatives had already requested permission to use the covenant's royal seal on international fundraising material before the formal application had even reached Charles. The seal was the official emblem certifying that work operated under Crown authority. Meghan's team had been preparing for victory before the king had even been asked. Charles stood near the window as Anne read the closing paragraph. When she finished, he drew the curtains himself. "There will be no negotiation over my mother's promise," he said. Camilla found him alone later and asked whether he was ready for the consequences. The monarch replied that a greater danger would be teaching the family that pressure counted for more than loyalty. Charles authorized the formal refusal, but before it could reach Meghan, a suspended palace contact leaked the decision. The king had drawn his line. Yet the betrayal ensured that Meghan would experience the rejection not privately, but as a humiliation waiting to detonate. The refusal ran to just 6 paragraphs, but its consequences rippled through the royal household within minutes. Meghan's request was denied. Her access to the patronage's advisors was cut off. Every informal discussion linked to the covenant was frozen. And yet the most painful sentence in the entire document was neither legal nor procedural. It stated that Catherine had never ceased to hold the role. In a single line, the palace both dismissed Meghan's argument and exposed the personal judgment hiding underneath it. Charles's response confirmed that the Queen's covenant for children and families would remain permanently under Catherine's stewardship. Stewardship meant the formal duty to protect and lead the patronage in the monarch's name. The role was not vacant, dormant, or open to temporary reassignment. Palace officials were ordered to close every discussion with Meghan's external team and to recover fundraising drafts still carrying unauthorized versions of the covenant's emblem. Meghan received the decision inside her London residence. She read the final paragraph, laid her phone face down on the table, and told Harry that the palace had chosen Catherine's image over children who needed global support. Her voice stayed level, but humiliation pulsed beneath every word. The rejection had not simply blocked her proposal. It had declared that her entire claim rested on a false reading of another woman's weakness. Harry asked the question she had been dreading. Had she really expected Charles to strip the patronage from Catherine? Meghan replied that she had expected the king to recognize capability. That single answer laid bare the competition sitting at the heart of the request. She had not seen herself as temporary support. She had seen the moment as a contest over which woman deserved the bigger royal platform. The fallout deepened almost at once. A palace communications officer surfaced a prepared announcement titled, "A New Global Chapter for the Queen's Covenant." The draft indicated Meghan's team had either expected approval or planned to build enough public pressure to make refusal politically impossible. William then discovered that a photographer had been booked outside a children's center where Meghan intended to make her first unofficial appearance tied to the role. Catherine received the restored covenant schedule from her private secretary. She closed the folder without celebration and requested that no palace statement attack Meghan. Children, she said, could not be reduced to props in a family war. The princess had regained control, but she refused to turn victory into revenge. Charles heard of Catherine's decision and fell silent. Her restraint stirred him more deeply than anger ever could have. In that moment, the king knew the late queen had entrusted the patronage to the right person. Then the crisis slipped past the palace walls. Photographs of Meghan arriving in London appeared online, and questions began circling about the meeting she was never supposed to disclose. The rejection had ended her claim on paper, but only a private conversation between Charles and Catherine could decide whether the damage would harden into permanent bitterness. Charles had expected Catherine to demand stronger protection, a public correction, or consequences for everyone who had assisted Meghan. Instead, when the two of them finally met without William, Camilla, secretaries, or legal advisors, the princess asked for something that startled him even more than the original claim. She did not want revenge. She wanted the patronage protected so it could never be turned into a weapon again. That request transformed the king's refusal from a temporary answer into a permanent royal settlement. Catherine arrived at Windsor alone and asked that no one else join them. She did not want William's anger or palace strategy shaping what came next. The meeting mattered because the dispute had already outgrown a single rejected application. It had exposed how easily illness, reduced duty, and private pain could be twisted into evidence that a royal promise had expired. Charles apologized before she could even begin. He admitted that Meghan's application should never have advanced far enough to force Catherine into defending a role Queen Elizabeth had already secured for her. The monarch knew his own hesitation had created doubt where there should have been certainty, and the princess had shouldered the emotional cost of that delay. Catherine then confessed what had wounded her most. Being described as inactive had reopened a fear she had never voiced aloud, that her reduced public presence had made the family view her as replaceable. Charles rejected the thought at once. Vulnerability, he told her, had never erased years of service, loyalty, or the trust placed in her hands. Catherine still refused to answer pain with cruelty. She told the king that Meghan's attempted takeover seemed driven by a desperate need to prove that leaving royal life had not shrunk her importance. The princess felt sadness for that need, even while recognizing the damage it had caused. Catherine asked for more than a refusal. She wanted the patronage charter rewritten so that no future monarch could ever interpret illness, pregnancy, family duty, or temporary absence as abandonment. The charter was the formal document defining how the covenant must be governed. Protecting it would protect every future royal from the same type of calculated challenge. Charles then revealed, through a private, documented instruction, that he had considered removing Meghan's right to reference any historical link to the covenant at all. Catherine urged him not to turn protection into personal punishment. Defend the institution, she told him, but do not feed another public war. Charles reached across the table and took her hand. He told her restraint must never again be mistaken for weakness, then signed the instruction, creating a permanent protective charter. As Catherine rose to leave, the king asked whether she could forgive Meghan. She answered that forgiveness might come privately, but trust could not be rebuilt by pretending betrayal had never happened. The revised charter was sent for announcement. At that same moment, a leaked copy of Meghan's rejected application landed inside a major television newsroom. Catherine had prevented justice from curdling into vengeance, but the public was about to be far less restrained. By sunrise, the conflict Charles had fought to keep behind palace doors was dominating Britain. The language of Meghan's request, Catherine's supposed inactivity, and the king's stunned response had migrated from private correspondence to breakfast broadcasts and crowded street conversations. But the public reaction was not shaped by constitutional clauses. It centered on one simple image: Catherine quietly returning to the work Meghan had tried to claim, without uttering a single hostile word. Palace officials confirmed only that an unauthorized request involving a protected royal patronage had been rejected. A royal patronage was an official charitable role carried on behalf of the crown, granting its holder influence, visibility, and responsibility. The palace refused to release Meghan's full submission or to discuss the private family meeting, but that silence only fueled the debate. Broadcasters framed the crisis as a test of royal duty itself. Were these appointments lifelong promises built through service, or high-value platforms that could be reassigned to whoever commanded the greater international audience? The argument mattered because Catherine's temporary reduction in public work had now been used to challenge whether loyalty still carried more weight than visibility. Meghan felt the humiliation grow with every fresh headline. Coverage focused on her attempt to replace Catherine, not on the donors and global partnerships she had proposed. Harry urged her to release the complete application and defend her motives. She refused. The most aggressive language inside it would have revealed that her team had treated the princess not as someone in need of support, but as an obstacle to be cleared out of the way. Catherine felt no triumph in any of it. She told her staff not to celebrate approval ratings or to treat public sympathy as a victory. The covenant, she insisted, had to return immediately to helping children and families. Her restraint stood in painful contrast to the leaked draft of Meghan's launch announcement, which described the patronage as entering more capable global hands. Charles answered that revelation with action. He authorized publication of the revised charter, the formal rules governing the covenant. It named Catherine as permanent principal steward and allowed temporary support only from working royals she personally chose. The attempted loophole was sealed shut. One newspaper caught the national mood with a front-page headline, "The patronage she could not take." Beneath it sat two photographs, Meghan walking into Clarence's house and Catherine greeting families at a children's center. Later that morning, a crowd gathered outside the center in South London. When Catherine arrived, the applause grew so loud that she paused, visibly moved, and pressed one hand to her heart. Britain had delivered its verdict, but Charles knew public emotion could not be the final word. As support gathered around Catherine, the king was preparing one last statement, not to prolong the scandal, but to close it with an unmistakable ruling. The world had witnessed the ambition, the pain, and the attempted seizure. Now the crown had to declare what it intended to remember once the noise faded. Charles's final decision was not delivered in anger. It arrived without insults, retaliation, or dramatic punishment, yet its meaning was absolute. Meghan would not receive Catherine's patronage. She would not represent it abroad. She would not use its royal identity to promote independent campaigns. The covenant would remain exactly where Queen Elizabeth had placed it. In defending that promise, the king finally answered a question that had haunted the monarchy for years: whether pressure could outmuscle loyalty. This time, it could not. Charles issued a formal declaration confirming Catherine as the permanent principal steward of the Queen's Covenant for Children and Families. The declaration was an official royal statement carrying the monarch's full authority. It confirmed that the princess would hold the role for as long as she remained part of the working royal household. No temporary absence could create a vacancy, and no replacement could be named without her agreement. Catherine returned to the Covenant's headquarters and gathered the staff in private. She told them the role had never been about possession, status, or defeating another woman. It was about keeping a promise to families who depended on stability. The princess had survived an attempt to convert her vulnerability into weakness, and yet she refused to treat the outcome as a personal triumph. Meghan left Britain without the announcement she had prepared. During a final recorded conversation with Harry, she admitted that she had underestimated how deeply the patronage was rooted in Catherine, and how firmly Charles would defend the late Queen's choice. Harry heard no anger in her voice. He heard disappointment, but also the first faint sign that she understood the boundary had become permanent. Charles ordered every unauthorized promotional draft destroyed. He also closed the dormant continuity clause, the rarely used rule that had allowed Meghan's team to argue for temporary control. No future claimant would ever be able to exploit that loophole again. Sir Malcolm Avery was stripped of all advisory access to restricted patronage records, ending the internal channel that had made the whole strategy possible. Charles visited Catherine after her first full covenant engagement. He did not mention Meghan, the leaked application, or the public backlash. He simply told the princess, "The promise is safe." Catherine answered, "Then the work can continue." That quiet exchange delivered the final verdict. Meghan's failure did not prove that she lacked compassion or ability. It proved that royal service could not be seized through ambition, publicity, or comparison. It had to be earned through trust, continuity, and sustained duty. Charles emerged with firmer authority. Catherine emerged with strengthened dignity. And the monarchy finally enforced a boundary it had avoided for far too long. The attempted takeover was over. Meghan lost the claim. Catherine kept the patronage permanently. And the king proved that the crown's deepest promises were never available to whoever demanded them most loudly. Visibility could pull the spotlight, but only loyalty earned the crown's trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.